Hi, all. Welcome back. The last part of the respiratory system that I want to talk about is how we control our breathing. What are the mechanisms that control the diaphragm? What kind of feedbacks do you have that control respiration rate, like how fast you're breathing, how deep you're breathing, etc. And then we'll talk a little bit about some ways at which this can be altered. Okay, so normal breathing is what we call rhythmic or involuntary. Okay, so an individual, when you're unconscious, okay, you will still continuously breathe, and that's an involuntary action. Okay, the respiratory regions or areas. We have groups of neurons that occur in the brain stem in two main regions. One, the medulla oblongata, okay, and then the other near the pons region, okay, and they stimulate the muscles that are associated with inspiration and expiration, depending on what's needed. Okay, so they really adjust kind of the rate and the depth of breathing. The main ones that we talk about is the medulla respiratory center. Okay, there's two groups of neurons, one that controls the rhythm, which we call the ventral respiratory group, and then one that controls or modifies it when activity levels change, and we call that the dorsal respiratory group. Okay. The pontine region is near the pons, and that controls the kind of depth or the duration of a breath. So how long you breathe for is really related to kind of the pontine respiratory group. Okay, so here you can see the medulla oblongata region, the pons region, and then the pontine respiratory group is kind of in the midbrain or close to the midbrain region, top portion of the midbrain region. The medulla oblongata, we've talked about its role before. Okay, its ventral group is going to be associated with just the basic rhythm, okay, controlling that diaphragm, controlling the intercostal muscles, okay. The dorsal respiratory group is going to signal the ventral respiratory group to change it, okay. So if you need to increase the contraction of these muscles, the dorsal respiratory group will send a signal to the ventral to increase how often that contraction occurs. Remember, the purpose of the contraction is just to change the volume. You change the volume, you change the pressure, and more air will come in, or air will come in faster. Okay? And you do this at multiple times, and that's kind of how breathing works. The pontine, though, on the other hand, is really controlling the entire medulla respiratory center. It's kind of like a check on the medulla respiratory center to say, well, what, you're breathing too long, or the respiration is taking too long. You need to speed it up. Okay, that kind of stuff. Okay, partial pressure. Let's talk about it real quick. Partial pressure is the pressure that a single gas contributes to the total pressure. Okay, so partial pressure is the amount of pressure that each gas contributes to the total pressure. So for example, if oxygen is 21% of air, then if you take 21% of 760 millimeters of mercury, that's what it is at sea level, then oxygen contributes 160 millimeters of mercury at sea level, and that's the partial pressure. Okay, if you are interested in something like nitrogen, okay, nitrogen's 78% or so of the atmospheric gas, and so you take 0.78 times it by 760, and that would be your partial pressure of nitrogen. If we're talking about carbon dioxide is less than 1%. So depends on the region, but you would take that value times it by 760, and that would give you the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So as you change the atmospheric pressure, you can change how much of that atmospheric pressure is related to the partial pressure, but you're not changing how much. So, for example, if we went to the top of Mount Everest, and let's just say, because I'm not quite sure what it is, but let's just say it's 250 millimeters of mercury. Okay? And we said, all right, well, 250 millimeters of mercury, what's 21% of that? That's your partial pressure of oxygen up there. It's still 21%. The amount of oxygen in the air doesn't change. Okay, it's just what's the pressure, and then how much of that is partial pressure is related to that gas. Okay, so the partial pressure is really just a method to refer to the relative amount of gas in a mixture instead of using like a concentration. And so it's more, I guess it's more uniform and more universal to relate it to partial pressure. More scientific. So there's quite a few things that can affect the rate and depth of breathing, including partial pressure, which we were just talking about, and we'll get into that. Okay, so the partial pressure of either oxygen or carbon dioxide, that can affect the rate, the depth of breathing. Okay? Other things might be how many hydrogen ions are in the body fluid, especially the blood. So remember, hydrogen ions are a measurement of the acidity or the pH of a system. So the change in pH, or the concentration of different body pHs of body fluids, can alter the rate and depth of breathing. Okay, how stretchy or the flexibility of the lung tissue. Okay, the emotional state, so the individual's hormones can relate to this. Okay, the level of physical activity. Is the body in need of oxygen for cellular respiration? Then that can change the rate and the depth of breathing. And then there's other things that are associated with, some of these things like chemoreceptors, which are going to pick up on, well, is there a chemical change? Is there too much CO2 in the system? Okay, is there, other things that could cause the chemoreceptor? Mechanoreceptors, is there too much stretch in those muscles? Not enough stretch? These kind of things. Are there muscle fibers firing and sending a signal back to the cortex, and then the cortex is sending the signal to the medulla oblongata to let it know, hey, my legs are moving, and moving fast, I need to up the amount of oxygen in that system. Okay, that's related to the mechanoreceptors and then chemoreceptors based on carbon dioxide maybe. Okay, so the whole system is very connected. So if you have changes in things like arterial pressure of carbon dioxide, which could cause the blood pH to go down, okay, which could cause the chemoreceptors now are relating to blood pH, okay, and now it's sending a sensory or neuron response to the medulla oblongata, okay, to basically say, hey, we need to up the amount of ventilation. We got to get rid of this CO2. The CO2 is too high. Okay? And so this can relate to a few things. Okay, plasma CO2, arterial CO2 levels, lots of things. Okay, same thing can happen though from a heart perspective. Remember, the heart's just a giant muscle, and so if the signal from the heart is that the heart is beating really fast, then in order for the blood that's coming out of the pulmonary trunk, okay, into the lungs, in order for them to be transfer oxygen into that blood, your respiration rate's got to increase. So there's that signal from the heart being sent back into the medulla oblongata to increase via the phrenic nerve to increase that diaphragm flexibility, so that diaphragm contraction just keep going faster and faster. Okay. All right. There's other things though that are a little bit more related to reflexes, and that's the Hering-Breuer reflex, and we'll talk about it here in a second. So again, back to the chemoreceptors that was just shown in that kind of that sketch or that diagram. Okay, normally that's related to either oxygen or carbon dioxide that's in the blood. And so if the oxygen levels are low, if the partial pressure of oxygen is low, then it's going to increase breathing rate. If it's really high, it might decrease the breathing rate. And so that can be true for carbon dioxide also. Okay, but mainly it's related to one of those two, either the pressure of oxygen or pressure of carbon dioxide. Okay. The Hering-Breuer reflex really has to do with the depth of breathing. Okay, and so this is based on the stretch of the lung. Okay, so these are stretch receptors. So as the lung stretches, it sends a signal. And so this prevents overstretching of the lungs. And so if the diaphragm is contracting, the thoracic cavity volume's increasing and you're filling, but that contraction just it's not relaxing. The diaphragm doesn't relax, or the muscles doesn't relax, and the thoracic cavity's volume's just open, and that lung tissue just keeps filling and filling and filling. Okay, then that Hering-Breuer HB reflex will come up, and it sends a signal. The stretch receptor sends a signal back to the medulla oblongata, back to the midbrain, and tells it, okay, stop stretching, stop sending the signal, okay, and basically preventing the over inflation of the lungs. Okay, so here you can kind of see how that works. So it's similar to a negative feedback. So you have this stimulation from the brainstem, from the medulla oblongata, that's going to say, all right, diaphragm contracts. All right, external costal muscles move. Okay, so it's flexing all these, opening up the thoracic cavity, changing the volume. Okay, the lungs are starting to fill, filling great. Now they've filled up enough. Okay, anything after this is going to be damaging. These stretch receptors now send a signal back to the brainstem that says, all right, no more. Okay, stop the signal. This needs to relax. The muscles need to relax, and then we can go back and do it all over again. All right, so some of these applications, okay, has to do with like the relationship between exercising and breathing. Okay, of course we always talk about aerobic exercise. It's really neat. It's great for the heart. It's great for the lungs. And we talked about this when we talked about heart function. Okay, indeed, it's true. It's needed. And that exercise will greatly increase the amount of oxygen used each minute. Okay, and the amount of carbon dioxide that is produced. Okay, so remember, this is related to that process that in 160 and a little bit in AMP1 that we talked a lot about, cellular respiration. It's that process of using glucose, using proteins, lipids, a little bit of nucleic acids to break those molecules down to get electron carrier molecules like NADH, FADH2, get those molecules, move them through the electron transport chain, generate ATP. Remember that in order for those electrons to be bound up, they have to bind to something. And that something is oxygen. Okay, and oxygen will bind up to those protons and those electrons that are moving through the electron transport system, creating what we call metabolic water. Okay, so that's water that's generated from these metabolic processes, or breaking down food items. Okay, in conjunction with that, carbon dioxide is being released because you're breaking down carbon molecules, and so carbon dioxide is being released through that process. So you're exercising, running a marathon, whatever it might be, running on a treadmill, and you're generating a lot of oxygen because your respiration is high. You're generating a lot of carbon dioxide because your metabolism is high, your metabolic rate's increased, you're burning through a lot of material, going through the cellular respiration cycle constantly. Now, as far as what occurs, just because your respiration rate is really high, what occurs in the system is not necessarily much of a change in the O2 and CO2 levels. Okay? It's because oxygen saturation occurs across the alveoli into the bloodstream. The blood can only hold so much oxygen. Okay? The blood can only deposit so much carbon dioxide. It can only hold so much carbon dioxide. So the limiting factor often in how much aerobic exercise you can do is not the lungs. It's actually the heart. How fast can the heart circulate the blood? If the blood can be circulated fast, okay, or faster by pumping the heart more, then you can supply oxygen to the cells that need it for cellular respiration. So the limiting factor is often not the transfer from the lungs to the blood, but rather it's really related to the heart. Okay, so talk a little bit about the mechanisms that might induce this increase in respiration rate and increase in cardiac output, so cardiac rate. Okay, the cerebral cortex is being signaled, okay, to increase breathing rate by muscles. So this gets signaled by muscle contraction. One of those muscles, one of those great muscles that is contracting is the heart. Okay, so the legs are contracting when you're running, okay, or maybe you're lifting weights or moving your arms a lot, whatever, swimming, okay, whatever the exercise might be, it's sending signals to the cerebral cortex, okay, which then signals the respiratory center to increase breathing rate. Okay. Now, again, like I said before, it's not really about the oxygen or CO2 levels in the blood. Okay, that's fairly consistent, fairly constant. Okay, it's how much blood is being delivered. Okay, so if you are running a race, a sprint, or whatever it might be, and you become short of breath, okay, normally that shortness of breath is not related to actually breathing, but it's more related to not having enough blood being transferred to the lungs. Okay, so the limiting factor is often that you don't have enough blood being pumped between the lungs and the body cells. Okay. So here we can look at kind of that membrane. We've talked about it quite a bit. You have this alveolus or the alveoli, okay, and you have this single membrane, single cell thick membrane, okay, that separates, of course, the capillary wall is a single layer thick also. So that separates these two entities, okay. The alveolus has high levels of oxygen. That oxygen is wanting to transfer into the red blood cells because the red blood cells have low levels of oxygen. Okay, that's diffusion. from high concentration to low concentration. The opposite is true. These blood being returned back to the heart and then through the pulmonary trunk and through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs are often going to be deficient in oxygen but have quite high levels of carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide concentration is going to be high here, low here. It's going to travel that direction. Okay, so you can see it here, diffusion of oxygen in this way, carbon dioxide this way. Okay, the way that partial pressure plays a role, and we'll get to this here in a second, but the higher the partial pressure is, the faster that transfer is. Okay, if it's near equal, okay, the transfer is going to be very slow. If the difference is much greater, then the transfer will be fast. And so you can see here this kind of blood cells very close to the alveolar space, very close to that membrane. Anything that changes the depth or the consistency of that membrane, if there's something that causes scar tissue to form because maybe you have damage from chemicals, if you cause other membranes and so maybe the distance increases and you have other membranes, that decreases that ability for that oxygen and CO2 to transfer across that space. Okay, and that really gets at what we were talking, what I was just describing, is that remember, membranes are phospholipid membranes. Okay? They allow gases, as long as the gas is not a charged gas or a charged molecule, they allow gases to permeate, are permeable to gases, meaning that gases can travel across the membrane. Okay? And they diffuse fairly readily. Okay? But again, they follow the rules that you learned back in 160, and that is things diffuse from high concentration to low concentration. So if there's lots of oxygen on one side, it's going to move to the region with less oxygen. Okay? That really gets at that partial pressure. High partial pressure moves to low partial pressure. Okay? The thinner the membrane, the less the distance is of travel, the more efficient it's going to be. You thicken that membrane, you increase the distance that those gases need to travel, the slower it's going to be. In fact, some things that we do to make scar tissue or really thicken the membrane can make it so that there's no transfer whatsoever. Okay? So several factors to affect that diffusion, what I was just talking about. Okay, so you want to increase diffusion, create more surface area. Okay, through evolution, it's already been done. Okay, alveoli sacs, little teeny grape-like projections. Okay, small, lots of surface area, lots of capillary beds wrapped around them. Okay, nice amount of surface area for a given volume. Perfect. Okay, shorten the distance of travel. Okay, make those membranes really thick, 1 cell thick. Okay, great, perfect for things to move across. Allow for gas to be soluble. Okay, the membrane itself, the phospholipid membrane, is soluble, so that creates that greater gas solubility. Okay, and then change the partial pressure gradient. Increase the partial pressure on one side, and that will move the material faster to the other side. Okay, you want to decrease diffusion? There are things that you can do. Change the surface area. Okay, so instead of having lots of little teeny alveoli, create one big alveolar sac with very limited volume or limited surface area to volume, and that's going to decrease your capability. Okay, harm those respiratory membranes, change them, make it so they have scar tissue that's associated with them, make it so they might be multiple layers thick. Okay, this kind of stuff would definitely change it. Okay, but the main driving force under normal circumstances is just a difference in partial pressure. Okay? If you can change the partial pressure, how much oxygen is partial pressure on one side versus the other side, then you'll get the diffusion to occur across the membrane. Okay? And you can see that here. Okay, so we'll talk about carbon dioxide, but partial pressure of carbon dioxide, okay, maybe it's 45 millimeters of mercury in the capillary bed, okay, and maybe it's 40 in the alveoli, okay, or the alveolus. Because it's higher here, it will travel across, but it's not much higher, okay, and as that progresses, it eventually becomes equal, and then you get no transfer, okay? And we'll get it to why that is, because not a lot of carbon dioxide is actually in gas form within the blood. Okay? Most of it is actually not in the gas form, okay? And we'll come back and talk about that. On the other hand, if we look at the partial pressure of oxygen, it's normally somewhere around 100, and you know, in the alveolus, and then in the capillary, maybe around 40. Okay, that transfers that difference is a great degree, and so this will transfer readily and welcomes that transfer very quickly. By the end of the capillary bed, okay, that transfer should be equal, so 104 in this case, and there's no more transfer. Okay? And that's how the oxygen is transferred into the red blood cells. So it's not really showing the red blood cells, but of course we know that oxygen is binding to the hemoglobin inside the red blood cell, and that's what's carrying it. Carbon dioxide can do that also, and we'll come back and talk about that here in a little bit. All right, before we get to that, let's talk about the effects of high altitude. So again, just to recap, when you're on top of a mountain or at higher altitudes, the percent of air is not any different. Okay, so the percent oxygen, a lot of people say there's less oxygen. No, that's not true. There's not less oxygen. The oxygen percent is still 21%. Okay, but the partial pressure decreases. Okay, so because the atmospheric pressure is lower, the pressure that oxygen is under is lower. Okay? The issue that we have with our system is that means that the oxygen molecule that is under less pressure has a harder time to bind to hemoglobin. It has a harder time to stick to hemoglobin. So the hemoglobin saturation declines. So as you increase in elevation, the partial pressure decreases and the hemoglobin saturation declines, which means often individuals have to increase their respiration rate to get enough oxygen to do their normal activities, okay? And that can cause altitude sickness, okay? So basically individuals start hyperventilating. So you have an increased heart rate, increased breathing rate, okay? Increased production of red blood cells and hemoglobin and all this in order to try to combat that inability for the hemoglobin to bind up oxygen, okay? Now, if you can get around the altitude sickness, the dizziness, the vomiting, that kind of thing, and you can stay at that altitude for a long period of time, this is why Olympians and other competitive athletes will often train at high altitudes, is because of this. They're making more red blood cells and more hemoglobin. So then when they leave those high altitudes and they go back to maybe sea level, okay, they have more red blood cells than you would expect, and they have higher amounts of hemoglobin, okay, and the partial pressure of oxygen is now higher, which means they have the ability to combine or bind up the hemoglobin to the oxygen, and they're good to go. And so that's why people train at high altitudes. Now, you can get, though, a true sickness, or what we call HAPE, okay, or high altitude pulmonary edema, and that's a severe altitude sickness. Okay, that's when you get that vomiting, nausea, etc. But then you also get issues with blood vessels. Okay, you get constriction in the blood vessels, sending blood under high pressure through the pulmonary circuit. It can cause ruptured blood vessels in certain regions. It can really increase the capillary pressure, and cause other things. It can cause fluid to leak into the lungs. There's just lots of things that can happen under high altitude pulmonary edema. All right, now some things that can impair that gas exchange. Some that are really common, like pneumonia. Pneumonia is an infection from a bacteria, okay? Typically, a bacterial pneumonia is, and that's going to cause inflammation. It's going to cause white blood cells to come to that region and start deteriorating and destroying that bacteria. It causes fluid to build up in the alveoli, okay? And when you get that buildup of fluid and white blood cells, that transfer of oxygen and carbon dioxide decreases, and it makes it much less permeable to the gases, okay? And so those situations occur. Now, pneumonia is very, very common. Tuberculosis is less common, but in some ways similar, okay? It's caused by a bacillus bacteria, tuberculosis, and it, again, is a lung infection, but instead of just relating to fluids and white blood cell counts and things like that, it causes the tubercles to thicken. Okay, so the respiratory membranes start to thicken, and that causes that surface area to be reduced and the gas exchange to the gas exchange to decrease. Okay, the other thing that can happen is the alveoli sacs can be destroyed, permanently damaged, and so you can get more dead space that occurs in tuberculosis also. Okay, acetylactasis or lung collapse. Okay, this is when the blood vessels collapse along the lung, and so this can be due to a few different things. It could be due to damage, like a force, like car wreck, airbags, something like that, that can cause that collapsed lung. It could be due, in some cases, it can be due to pneumonia or other infections that might cause enough damage that the obstruction is high enough that the lung doesn't have the ability to inflate and it collapses. And then the last one, acute respiratory disease syndrome. Okay, this is normally a form of acetylactasis, which the alveolar collapse, but it's a more advanced, and so lung collapse. Some individuals can kind of fight through this. They can still get enough gas exchange to run their body, but when you have acute respiratory distress syndrome, normally that causes at least for the time being, it causes damage that decreases the functionality of the individual. Normally it causes really high heart rate. Okay, the heart rate is trying to combat the inability to deliver oxygenated blood. Okay, blood vessels and airways, they all start to narrow down because now you have inflammation in this region and you have constriction of all those, and it can be very damaging and impair the individual, and can be life-threatening for that fact. All right, so let's look at that hemoglobin saturation curve real quick, just to kind of look at what we're talking about when we talk about the effects of altitude. So again, altitude itself, the oxygen amount is not really decreasing, it's not really changing. It's just the ability for hemoglobin to be saturated, or hemoglobin to take up that oxygen. So you know that we said that about 160 partial pressure is what oxygen is at under normal circumstances at about sea level, right? So, well, that would account for 100% saturation. Really, you don't get much of a change until you're about 90 partial pressure, okay? And if you're looking at something like the top of Mount Everest, it is right around 50 partial pressure of oxygen. So even at the top of Mount Everest, the saturation would be still around 85%. Okay, but 85% saturation is enough to drive um, issues that individuals might see, like acute altitude sickness. Okay, so most individuals that might train at high altitudes, they want to train, around maybe 90, 80, so they can get about 95% saturation. Okay, so it's inducing the response of the body to build more red blood cells, build more hemoglobin, but it's not to the point where you're driving altitude sickness. Okay. So here's kind of, again, how that works. Just a little bit different of a diagram with the O2 transport. Okay, so that partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli sac, okay, about 100 millimeters of mercury. Okay, it's diffusing in, captured by the hemoglobin. Hemoglobin's carrying that. Okay, again, gets to the tissue that's needed. The tissue has less partial pressure of oxygen, so then the blood cell, that oxygen will leave, it'll diffuse into the tissue, okay, and then that blood will return back, okay, and do it all over again, okay, and so often, this is kind of the cycle that we would typically see. Now, as the blood returns, its partial pressure decreases, okay, because it's losing oxygen to tissue, okay, and so then it can gain oxygen back when it goes back past the alveolar sac. All right, so we can look at kind of the relationship of partial pressure to saturation, okay, and how it relates maybe to partial pressure of CO2. Okay, so the greater the partial pressure of CO2, the less saturation or less ability for hemoglobin to become saturated. And that's partly because CO2 will saturate hemoglobin. Okay, so the lower the CO2, the partial pressure of CO2, the faster the rate of hemoglobin saturation will be. Okay, at lower partial pressures of oxygen. So even at right around 100, what we were seeing there, at high levels of partial pressure of CO2, okay, you might still be at 95% saturation. Okay, now how does pH affect this? So if we look at the pH of blood, which is related to CO2, okay, if your blood becomes acidic or goes through acidosis, okay, you might see that that partial pressure curve is very similar to the partial pressure curve or the saturation curve that we see with CO2. How about temperature? Okay, so at really low temperatures, saturation of hemoglobin is really high. Okay, so you don't need much partial pressure um, of oxygen to get high levels of saturation at low temperatures. Okay, the higher the temperature, the less ability for hemoglobin to be saturated. Now, vice versa is true though. Is the lower the temperature, the less likely the hemoglobin is going to release the oxygen also. So it binds to the oxygen very well at low temperatures, but it also doesn't release the oxygen at low temperatures. So in cold environments, Okay, you're going to be able to bind oxygen fairly readily, and then you're going to need to heat that up to body temperature in order to release it, and that's going to take energy to do so. All right, now carbon dioxide transport, again, I told you that I kind of hit on this a little bit because it's different than oxygen transport. So oxygen transported by hemoglobin, okay? Carbon dioxide can be transferred by hemoglobin also, okay? So it can bind to the hemoglobin molecule also after it's in that bicarbonate form. It can dissolve and bind to hemoglobin and cause a carbaminohemoglobin, which is carbon dioxide and hemoglobin mixed. And so that can take up a little bit of the space for oxygen to bind to that carbon dioxide. So some of the carbon dioxide that's in your blood will be dissolved in the plasma. Okay? And it will be released from the plasma. Okay, so a portion of that. Some will be dissolved as a combination of hemoglobin and carbon dioxide, and some will be in the form of carbonic acid, okay, and then have to be broken down to release, to be able to be released back into the alveolus. Okay, so it will come in from the cell after cellular respiration. Some CO2 dissolves right into the plasma as a gas, some combined with hemoglobin, and some combined with water to form carbonic acid. Okay? When it returns back to the alveolus, okay, some will dissolve directly from the carbon dioxide straight out of the plasma. Some will be broken back down into carbon dioxide from that carbonic acid, and then some will disassociate with the hemoglobin and leave from that matter. Okay? So this is kind of what it looks like from a perspective. Oxygen, about 1 to 2% dissolves directly into plasma, so not very much. Most of it is bound to hemoglobin, which we call oxyhemoglobin. Okay? Carbon dioxide, more can dissolve directly into the plasma as carbon dioxide, as the gas. Okay, about 23% will form a carbaminohemoglobin. Okay, so that means it's the carbon is binding to hemoglobin, and then the 70% is carbonic acid or a bicarbonate ion. Okay, and so again, that kind of complicates things just a little bit when we talk about that transfer of carbon dioxide in the reverse form, right? Carbon dioxide leaving the body. It can be in a few different forms, which can complicate things a little bit. But in general, similar to oxygen, as long as the concentration is higher in the blood when it moves past the alveolar sac, okay, as long as the concentration of carbon is higher, it will disassociate, it will move across the membrane, go into the airspace, and then be expelled out of the body. Okay? Whether that's coming out of the plasma as a gas, whether it's being disassociated with hemoglobin, or whether it's being broken down from a bicarbonate molecule, either way, it will occur. Okay? All right, to end, I really just hit on lifespan changes and kind of how that works. So first of all, as an individual increases in age, we've talked about this before, cells start to deteriorate. And part of the cell deterioration can be those cells that are constantly being bombarded by things that occur in the atmosphere. So these ciliated epithelial cells that are lining the upper and lower tracts of the respiratory system, those cilia start to die off. Those epithelial cells, they start to die off. They become fewer in numbers. The globulate cells that produce that mucus tend to reduce in number, and they just don't work as well. So the mucus tends to thicken. It tends to build up a little bit. So this is why people, as they age, they tend to cough more, they gag more, they swallow more saliva, and these kind of things occur. And that's because the cilia and ciliated cells just aren't functioning as well as they once did. Okay, other things, of course, your immune system starts to deteriorate over time. So the number of macrophages, they start to decrease. So you lose the efficiency, that you lose the efficiency of those macrophages and the ability to rid the body of damaged material. Okay, and so based on that, you increase your chances that bacteria or a virus can make it into the lungs and get established. This is often why we believe that COVID affected elderly people much more than it did young people, is because they were not able to fight off this novel virus, and while young people could. And so that's fairly typical. What we see with respiratory infections increases, age of the individual increases. Okay, other things like the muscles that are associated with breathing, they can start to wear down. They don't work as efficient, so breathing becomes more difficult. The normal resting breathing rate, it tends to go down. So now maybe individuals have to increase their respiratory rate or breathe a little harder. The cartilage stiffens. There's all kinds of things that are going on as an individual ages. The connective tissue starts to replace the muscle in the bronchioles. So then the dilation, okay, and contraction, it doesn't work as well any longer. The bronchial walls start to thin. Okay, they don't open as much. All kinds of things. The alveoli walls start to thin. They start to be damaged more often, creating greater dead space that occurs as an individual ages. Okay, so yeah, in a way, it sucks to get older, but in general, these are just some of the functions, and we see this throughout lots of different body systems. That as you age, cells start to break down, and they don't function as well as they once did. Okay, we leave it at that.